Can and introduce Professor Ajeet Singh. Thank you very much for coming. This is a collaborative event with Kimberley Health Professionals Network and the Regional Training Hub. So thanks, and I hope you have a lovely evening. Yeah.
All right, and basically I thought I'd start by explaining how and why I'm here. So I got lost on the way here a bit. Luckily, I know some locals. I've been coming to the Kimberley, particularly group, for 14 years. And my start in the Kimberley began with suffering trauma. So my wife and I, our 3-year-old, developed catastrophic epilepsy in childhood in 2011. And that was a difficult year. So my wife, being the glue of the family, said at the end of the year, we need a break. What's the furthest point from Geelong? And so I've been coming back every year since, and we even bought a place we rent that sometimes use here. And our neighbours, the Kavanaghs, so Des and Gareth, have been the sort of inroad. I've thought for many years to contribute to the mental health landscape in the Kimberley, and I thought the best way I could do that was not injecting myself into it until now. So you guys are the front line in this Karawat, this soil. And so I'll always be open to being stood corrected, and everything I say can be adapted. It's quite a big topic. I must be a bit masochistic. I picked one, and it's going to be quite deep. About a third of my practice is individual psychotherapy for people who've had significant trauma, as heavy stories as you could have heard. The ones who want help to sort out their self-relationship, they come to me. And being based in Geelong, you have to be a generalist. If I'd stayed in Melbourne CBD, I would have never learned the psychotherapy skills, because the ethic would be refer them a block away to the 10 psychoanalysts. I didn't have that luxury. So over the last 20 years, my patients have basically taught me what to do. End of last year, I wrote a little book on how I do what I do, and it's going quite well amongst the big wig analytic people. And so I'm also going to talk a little bit about the approach I use, so you get a sense of what happens when somebody wants to actually repair what's there. And then we will sort of break for a meal. Save questions, and I want questions, I do jot them down, but because there's a lot to get through, we'll probably leave them for the end, and you can get me on online email after. This is not a job for me, this is a purpose. So the opening sort of slide, there's so many pictures, and this is an incredible lithograph by Kathy Kollwitz, who was a German lady who survived the First and Second World Wars as a German, and she produced a lot of artwork about trauma. So I thought this was a beautiful way to start. And then I'm a professor, but I try not be the Professor Wanker type, so you can just call me AJ. I've got like over 150 publications, mainly in brain genetics, but my side interest has been trauma till now. I'm actually going formally into it. And that's another reason why I'm giving this talk. Obviously, talks like this, there needs to be a disclaimer, not a brainless substances disclaimer. People have trauma, it's ubiquitous. To some extent, it makes us strong. There's like bugs strengthen our B cell and immune system, but the toxic trauma is ubiquitous as well. So it may be triggering for people. This is a supportive environment. If you need to time out, headphones in, I won't take it personally, at least not very long. And the main thing is, this is hope, not despair. People heal. And I'm going to explain how. A bit of an outline, because there was a lot to cover. I'm going to start with a lot of the latest information about where we stand as a nation, not as a region or a group, but as a nation in terms of trauma. I'm going to talk a lot about do no harm, which will help every level of the healthcare system, whether you're an ED, whether it's assertive care with Mental Health Act, whether it's individual therapy. Do no harm is actually doing something. It can seem like nothing, and it tends to be neglected when people Google up this area. Facilitate healing, I'm going to dive into. You don't have to go into, but if you want to do deep karate, there's deep karate going to be presented tonight. Nothing too scary. And then the future. Now, people are always better than machines. Psychiatrists are great if you can access one and afford one. Two massive stumbling blocks, right? So whether there'll be a way of augmenting grassroots services with sort of assistive technologies going on. And then some takeaways. And again, these slides, the link to a Google Drive, you can ask any of the admin staff, or I'll send them copies of it. And then this book I kind of soft released at the end of last year. I didn't want to be one of those people endlessly pushing their book, and I just did it slightly softly and got the sort of psychoanalysts of Melbourne to read it, assuming that they would laugh me out. And then last week they inducted me into their little peak. So I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'll tell you later. But I think it means that maybe this is a fresh take on actually how to heal people. And it's very good news in it. So the first sort of section is denial to acceptance action. Now, some people might be familiar with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So there's a Swiss-born American psychiatrist and really a pioneering female doctor. Her father was a businessman, tried to force her to become a secretary. She ran away from home and became a physician, and then went into psychiatry, trained at Harvard. And she wrote a very small little book, not thinking it'll do much. It just got published in the sort of seminary local periodical, and it basically became the forerunner of what we call the Kubler-Ross stages of grief, death and dying, or change. And interestingly, the bedrock of the therapy approach that I have learned from patients relies on a grief healing system we all have. I tell my patients, if you're suicidal and you hold your breath, deeper parts of the brain will say, no, breathe. And there are deep parts of the brain which I believe help us digest unimaginable trauma. And I'll explain that. And that's at the start, the good news. If you remember nothing else, I'd say the good news is actually, I think there's this powerful thing, as powerful as our brainstem, breathe when you're suicidal. And there's one that can help digest stuff. But at a wider level, I think there is still a mass denial about the level of trauma. And so through the course of 2021, there was a large national survey done telephonically, mobile phones, limitations, but quite rigorous, Australians 16 to 65, asking about childhood trauma, anything that happened to them pre the age of 18. And many of the results of this were published in 2023 in the Medical Journal of Australia. So it's a fairly up-to-date, robust data set, N of 8,503. And about 3,500, 41% odd were young people, so defined as 16 to 24. People under 16 were excluded for ethical reasons. It was all ethically vetted to a high degree with support workers. People had bad reactions to being asked things. But it also included older age groups as well, their retrospective recall of having survived toxic levels of trauma. It covered physical abuse, sexual abuse, pretty easily defined in the standard sort of definitions. Harder to define is emotional abuse and neglect. So any kind of body of research is got limitations. Perfect research doesn't exist. And that self-disclosure of emotional abuse was very inclusive to not invalidate anybody. So if somebody was grounded for being drunk at 15, at 17, they might say that was a traumatic experience. But I think that was the exception, not the rule. It was very much talking about stuff that led to ongoing dysfunction in your life. So nothing sort of trivialised. As well as it captured sort of vicarious trauma, just off the end of lockdowns as well, which I know in Western Australia, what were lockdowns, Victoria, we know lockdowns. And so there was also potentially an overrepresentation of seeing family violence hot off the lockdowns in the eastern states. But again, every data set's got limitations. It's good they had a red hot crack. So I really dislike this slide because I don't like the truth always, but the truth doesn't care what we think of it. And the thing that stands out to me is the rates of sexual abuse. So this is well replicated across nations in past surveys in Australia. So you're looking at, about 30% of people saying they had sexual abuse before 18. So we don't want to hear it, but this doesn't help. It might help us temporarily. And this is a very robust measure because you're basically saying pre-18, did somebody molest you in one way or the other? It's not like we scolded for being drunk at 15, which maybe was tough life parenting. And so the rates are very high, disproportionately affects females, but also males as well. So it's kind of staggering, a staggering rate of a whole population sample. This is not a special needs group, it's the whole sample of the populace of Australia. Amongst the younger cohort, that same high rate, 25 to 26% experience sexual abuse of 16 to 24-year-olds. And again, the other types of abuse there as well. So very high rates of abuse. And we know there's a huge nexus to mental ill health, but physical ill health as well. And I think the gist of it is if you're not treated with respect in childhood, you do not develop a self-respect, self-relationship. So you don't engage in economic opportunities, scholastic, health, both prevention, early intervention. And so the demoralisation of self really destroys that core self-coaching ability. But a close nexus to people reporting mental illness, and you see sixfold PTSD. So PTSD is that sort of classic Vietnam War veteran remembering the Vietnam War pattern. But a bigger group, which is more important for me clinically, is complex trauma and borderline personality cohort. It's a poor term, but really a complex PTSD from childhood, which then really twists the self-relationship and requires specific treatments. And then there's more data as well that really kind of wakes us up. If you look at substance abuse, it's not often as simple as saying, stop doing it. It's almost like you're insulting people's intelligence. Sometimes it's just woven into either coping, masking symptoms, or self-destruction. Suicide, one cigarette at a time, one cone at a time. Sometimes it's communication, seeking help. And again, I think these statistics point out also the nexus to physical health, problematic eating and obesity, alcohol, cigarette smoking, and that's this juxtaposition of trauma to poorer total health outcomes, life expectancy, etc. Kind of makes sense. So I think reducing denial, and if you spot any typos, let me know. I crowdsource editing. This is a website, our taxes are funded it, Australian Childhood Maltreatment Study, ACMS. And I think we all need to be awake if we're in the helping professions. If we don't want to do this, we should go into banking or something. Engineering, we need plumbing and stuff. But if you're working in anything, physical medicine, psychological medicine, if you don't know this, it's a bit not knowing what a fever is or an acute abdomen is or suicidal ideation is. It's just ubiquitous. About 30% of people have significant childhood trauma. Not all are affected. So I remember years and years ago, this lovely lady in her 20s bought this even more shiningly wonderful 70-year-old grandmother who was distraught. She just got the letter from the orphanage in Ireland where she'd emigrated from, that they were getting compensation for all the abuse that happened there. And she didn't want to take the money. She just had it all walled off, didn't want to, and was happy. And all my only intervention, you don't have to. If you're going good, that's more than enough. So she threw away the check, which was not a huge amount of money, and was happy. And so not everybody is affected. Sometimes the walling off system, dissociative systems, natural grief healing in communities, people find an equilibrium. So I think evangelical trauma therapy is ill-advised. If somebody's holding their own and they don't want to go there, it's unwise to go there. So not all are affected, but many are. And an openness to saying it's okay if you are, it doesn't mean we're glad you are, and then pathways to stabilise or treat. And that self-disrespect relationship, I think, is the core issue when somebody has abuse. And it has then the manifold ramifications of not engaging in the opportunities. So if you think you're worthless, the government can throw $1 trillion at the problem, whatever the problem is defined. But if they don't recognise the problem as I think I'm worthless, I'm going to sabotage or avoid these things that might be good. It sort of goes in circles. And I believe this is one of the dynamics in various initiatives which seem to run out. And whether you call it self-sabotaging or really just reenacting the abuse as self-object. Instead of, being a problem or self-sabotaging, it's a bit of a negative term, but just reenacting the abuse, neglect. I was neglected, I was abused, I self-abused, I self-neglect. I was told I'm not worth anything, all this stuff, everything up, I felt, just let that out. And when you understand that, I think you start to have that compassion focus instead of compassion fatigue. We know that it's complicated trauma. I talked about my individual trauma, family trauma, my broom story, but there is mass trauma. So in Melbourne, Geelong was almost as bad as Melbourne. People don't talk about it. It was that bad. It was like very traumatizing. Almost like Victorians feel like a sub group, Australia. And it gets culturally also, there can be mass traumas. And I, don't need to lecture to the community here. And then these traumas can also become intergenerational. And we know this biologically, so epigenetics, methylation, basically gene silencing. It's probably a whole lot of circuits where if you're in an adverse environment, you just go to this chaos rapid breeding cycle. And so you have pregnancy by 12, third child by 15, iterate through the environment to survive. So again, there's evolutionary design thinking, even why Mother Nature gives us that system. Equally, there will be groups where it's the converse. They develop supportive networks, cultures, advanced technology. So you might have one tribe breeding heavily, 10,000 people with clubs, another tribe breeding less heavily, 1,000 people with bow and arrow, and the two fight. So again, evolutionary design thinking is a way of making sense of why it's almost like every community, every nation. You almost see those two sort of tiers that can coexist in the one community. So trauma is complex. That intergenerational collective trauma, there needs to be sensitivity, hypersensitivity. So there's sort of cliche. So like I say, women have suffered historically, and I do it, and I say it as a chore. I do harm. Whereas if I say, I'll never know what it's like to be a woman, respected, suffering, for example. That's all. I don't have to be hyper dressed in pink 24/7, yelling out free window. So I think even that finding a sensitive balance and even refreshing how you go about those sorts of things, I think is very healthy because it's got stale and a lot of people go through the motions, and I think that does harm. That feels ingenuine. So do no harm. The Hippocrates, one of the European fathers of modern medicine. Simple wisdom though, the old wisdom lasts. So often, particularly when I was a younger doctor, I was so keen to do something and show I knew something and I didn't know much. And then as you get older, it happens here at a time, start to reflect sometimes the best thing to do is to not give false hope, not over-investigate, over-treat, over-manage. Like the lady who survived the Irish orphanage to say, look, if you're going good, you don't need psychiatry. You just had one psychiatric consult, not 10 years of supporting the psychiatric industry, which it could have been if we unravelled it. So I think do no harm is doing something. It's actually doing a lot. And with that, the trap is nihilism. What's the point? It's like, just wave the white flag, do no harm. So we want to be realistic, but not nihilistic. And so settings are important. People with trauma work in these settings. People with trauma present to these settings, custodial police settings, primary care settings, ED settings, school settings. I was talking to a police officer friend in Geelong, and I said, being a police officer is really like being a social worker with a gun. He said, yes. And he said, you're one of the doctors that gets it. Oh, yeah. Okay. Most don't, but it's sort of, so the setting is key and it makes it difficult. So I thought, how do I communicate this? Rome wasn't built in a day, but it can be burnt down in a day. Brief interactions cannot heal deep trauma. Cannot. Brief interactions can exacerbate both trauma and demoralisation. So like I say to my patients in trauma therapy, it's a fine line between renovation and demolition. Kind of. And the demoralisation, I think, comes from false hope. And I think mental health is really, it's a big problem. Are you okay? Get help. then they do, and then their needs are complex, and we say, get out of here. And we don't want to say that, but it's often the case. So I think it's be brave early when you talk about, encouraging help seeking, but realistic about resource provisions of the journey. And that kind of tough love up front will do a lot better. A lot of patients I see say, I was offered the world by Headspace and this, that, and the other. Then at 26 was out because I hadn't got better in 10 sessions. And I said, well, a lot of people do get better, but a lot don't. And so that honesty, I think, can really refresh things. And so it's great you're getting help, but it's these resources are limited. And we don't want to demoralise you with too much hope, too much expectation, not enough delivery. So even that, trying to just give you a few chestnuts to take away rather than this being something you can look up on Wikipedia. Projective identification. So kind of psychoanalytic sort of semi-conscious defense mechanisms. I remember being a trainee, trying to get people to explain these things to me, and I think a lot of people didn't know what they were. So projective identification is largely due to trauma from childhood or issues growing up. Unconsciously, you provoke somebody to becoming the bad object that attacked you growing up. So like the impossible, you're impossible, and then that person finally snaps the calm. So like I might be seeing a patient going, I've been having a good day. I don't think I'm a monster. I was feeling good 5 minutes ago. And then the whole demeanor of an interaction with a patient is you hate me and you're a bad doctor. And then all of a sudden I feel angry. So there's this capacity almost to elicit an attacking or abandoning response. And when you get good at identifying it, this is transference, countertransference. The emotional vibe, your emotional equilibrium is suddenly altered. So you're doing your day, it might be a bit tired, a bit cranky, but it's there. And then it's like, what's going on there? Look for the transference, countertransference, beware projective identification. Maybe they're trying to turn me into the boogeyman, but I'm going to resist that. Or say, look, I know, I hear what you're saying, but I think we should maybe meet again in a week, or I'm not sure this is being productive. Projective identification happens in all settings in healthcare. And sometimes they'll get you to collude with saying, you're hopeless, you're a problem, even thinking that. And this is a real big problem. If obviously you don't act on it as a professional, but in terms of emotional burnout, massive issue. When you start to capture it, you go, this maybe is projective identification, you wall it off, you get up and go, yeah, I'm fine, and then that, and then I'm not going to hate them, and that's probably bad stuff, and you can actually navigate it. So this projective identification, do your own homework on it more, but the good thing if you get some skills at identifying, and it takes away some of that judgment, frustration, nihilism. This patient's self-cut 50th time in a row, or overdose, or we keep treating the diabetes, but they don't take the medicine. We can end up with renal dialysis. What's the point? But again, if you understand there may be a trauma talking through, you don't add to that by having an antagonistic vibe. Professionally, you'll do everything, so you keep your registration, the vibe. Yeah, it's like, yes, what do you want? They feel that. And so that can actually do harm. This is the original Prochaska di Clemente, 1902. Everyone changed with smoking, in this case was their first paper. But not everybody's ready for change. So sometimes we pull our hair out, whereas if you just go, oh, look, they're pre-contemplation. They're not ready to end the cycle of not goodness. And so we just accept that. And because that prognostic limiting effect is they're not ready to engage with goodness at the moment, but we're not going to hate them. And we're kind of in the wings. Sometimes we can almost feel like we've got to push them along. They're always backbones, because it's always experienced as coercing controlling. Equally, you don't want to enable them and just go, yeah, there's no problem. I'll see something. It's like, no, needed. So like the number of patients with trauma and say substance abuse years, and then they both say, maybe I'll do that detox, and inwardly, and then that can recharge you against a 20 times before where it's the same cycle. So thinking about whether they're pre-contemplative or ready to engage is useful. Care of burnout and compassion fatigue. So this affects us too. So unless you have no empathy and no remorse, which makes it sort of burnout proof, and we'll talk about that later. If you care, if you're an empathic nurturer, you will get burnt out, you will get compassion fatigue. So my joke to my patients, if I, Friday afternoon, so it's Friday afternoon, I've got compassion fatigue. And then actually there's a rapport. So if you're human and an empath, you'll get compassion fatigue. It's okay to mention it and debrief and support, and even, just notice that compassion level's not high. And this will be a big protection against your own carer burnout. There are dilemmas. So like, like you're smacking a child, always evil. It's an endless dilemma. What's the best way to raise children, love children? If they're currently about to burn the house down and you've done everything, is that smack on the wrist after 3 months of evil? I don't know. It's kind of, is sometimes the time to call the police and mental health act, or the family violence is going nowhere. Sometimes you just need to, tough line, the word line. Dilemmas. Use the word dilemma. So a problem has got a perfect solution. Credit card bill due tomorrow, got the money, pay it today. A dilemma doesn't have a perfect solution. I don't have the money to pay the bill, what do I do? How best to love? How best to manage complex situations? So just simply by saying it's a clinical dilemma. What do we do with this family? Do we let them keep rolling, or do we have to call the boys and girls at some point? This thing's blowing up. You can even write it's a clinical dilemma. It's just showing you're agonising. Same with parenting. Is this yelling by the third near fire enough, or and then do you let them burn their fingers deliberately? But is that abuse? Now, clear abuse, you'd know. If you're burning kids for fun, that's not good. If you're just letting them do their own thing and the house burns down, it's neglect. Or they want a Tim Tam 10 times a day, so they end up morbidly obese at 12. Is that loving parenting? So I think that tough love comes in, and that moral injury, and have your own sort of formulation of having a sense of that, but use language like clinical dilemmas, prognostic limitations, status of change. But sometimes you do need to ring IIII. So I've had patients that put under the Mental Health Act, assuming that'll be the end of our therapeutic relationship. They come back and they say thank you. Like majority, like 90% saying, I needed that. And I almost respect that you sort of doing that assertive, containing tough love. And so I'll explain mental health act. I'll say, yeah, you're better now. It's tough love is a real dilemma. And so these are some of the things we do. The big one is not everybody should be a parent. Parenting is major, much harder than driving a car. Driving a car is nothing. We're doing a plane. I don't fly a plane, but flying a plane would be nothing to parenting. But it's a basic human right. And so unfortunately, I think one of the rate limiters is probably a certificate to parent, because it's challenging. Not everybody's suited temperamentally, constitutionally, plus control rise. So unfortunately, I think we'll never get it down to zero badness in family situations. And this is another one of those kind of, dilemmas. And it's a human right, so we can't fully take that away. So you would have seen these sort of standard sort of things, and again, it's kind of, these are the common sense basics. Realise violence and trauma, recognise how it might be presenting and projective identification, self-harm, mental health, endlessly not engaging in preventative medicine, anything you wire, they just self-sabotaging. And then respond. The best way to respond is just kind of compassion. And if you can't see a solution path, just so that we're here, care, and we're not going to be part of the problem, and resist that, re-traumatisation of sort of giving up with people or buying into that nihilism, futility, or even animosity, like, oh, this is a waste of the healthcare resources. You hear again. Like sometimes you get that tension, and get your own supervision and support to debrief that as well. So I think the common sense basics, complexity, sophistication, those little pointers, dilemma awareness, and then you get trauma-informed care. So trauma-informed care is about people. It's about people, groups of people, which are cultures and systems. The culture bit's exciting because that could be intergenerational good. Normally when I think intergenerational, my brain will think intergenerational harm. Maybe intergenerational good is the opportunity as well. We could do intergenerational good, and tonight's everybody here is part of that. So facilitating healing. So this is going to be more of the deep dive, and I wanted to not gloss over the stuff I do. So I'm the guy, send the person to do the one-to-one work. If they've got major trauma. Trauma-focused care is basically, so trauma-informed care is knowing the basics. Trauma focus is your trauma therapist of some kind or the other. And so we'll go through some basics and advanced stuff. So most people have heard of DBT, dialectic behavioural therapy, and there'll be services. And it's really a suite of skills to help behaviourally stabilise somebody so that they're less chaotic. Individual group sessions, telephone, online-based things. Skills really to emotionally regulate better, be less self-destructive. So I remember I once had a patient, a lovely person with trauma, when they were distressed, they'd slash their face. And then the staff in the hospital found it quite stressful. And I knew there was a lot of pressure on me to do something. And I didn't really do anything. And then eventually I said, oh, I know you love your kids, and maybe it'd be better to do it on your out of fives that doesn't distress your kids. And she never did it on the face again because she was an empath. She just hadn't considered the impact. And she's not cutting it all down, but that's the longer story. So sometimes just diverting the harms away. Any kind of compassion bond is supportive psychotherapy. So the jargon we use is auxiliary ego function. So we've all got people in our lives, but there's an unspoken rule that you unload, I unload. Supportive psychotherapy is one way. You listen, you're reasonable, you problem solve a bit. Everybody who's got empathy and an ability to read people and be a secure attachment, you can be a stabilizer. So I'll say, I'm your brain co-pilot. With my patients, I say, I'm your brain co-pilot. And if there's major turbulence, just remember I'm the captain, but then you've got the joystick as well. So just that support is a good base, and it requires that continuity of care, which is often missing in systems where there's rotation of staff. So that's a systematic dilemma when there's staffing issues. Sometimes it's that 6 monthly new worker is an abandonment event, and then they think, why should I open up to the next one? They'll leave in 6 months, and they've got a point. So you can almost start with it. Once I've come only here for 6 months, I'm going to kind of sort of abandon you in 6 months. That's not ideal. And just that's human to human connection. And they might disclose to a certain extent, where you might try and enable some continuity through a local long-term counsellor or their own journal. EMDR, most of you would have heard of. So this is really kind of the strongest version of exposure-based therapy for the adult type PTSD, when people get nightmares, avoidance, physical touch reactions to trauma. Highly sort of effective. Again, somebody has to be ready, renovate, demolish. And it does seem, that I used to think the waving of the finger was strange. It does seem to do something. It seems to be more than generic distraction coping, or people talk about terrible things. It seems to help them process it. So again, this is one of the areas. And do you have EMDR therapists in Bali? Yeah. So you can see, and we need 20 to 30. And then schema therapy, which if you don't know schema therapy, you can look up, it's almost like psychodynamic therapy, self-relationship and trauma patterns. So that, being a traumatized child or a traumatized parent, and maladaptive thinking, coping. It does need longer term involvement. It's almost like traditional psychotherapy, painting by numbers, but the idea is people will internalise being the unhelpable child or the toxic parent and repeat those cycles again and again. Many of the principles are based on the original Freudian principles, which had significant issues. This is a modernised version. So again, you can buy these books, read them, and just like me in Geelong 20 years ago, it's not like there's 20 psychoanalysts around the corner. You might say, look, I'm not a psychoanalyst, but should we talk about these things again in the context of making sure you've got the right backup, clinical backup, and not out of your depth. Now, Freud had a big impact, and he, was a prolific writer, and he really, pre-Freud, people didn't think childhood affected you mentally and otherwise. They didn't believe invisible stuff you're not aware of, unconscious stuff could make you behave in certain ways. So there was heaps of stuff where he was like the Einstein of the area, but there was a very significant issue with Freud in that he refused to believe childhood abuse stories of his patients. And he would say that actually you have these perverse fantasies to have intercourse with your parent. So the Oedipal and Electra complex, Oedipus Rex, the the sort of ancient Greek tragedy where unwittingly this hero ends up killing his father and marrying the mother, and then he tears his eyes out. So a huge controversy with Freudian thinking is really, did he minimise the reports of child trauma? And pretty cleverly did, and twisted it around to saying there are all these perverse impulses from children. I thoroughly disagree. And that's why there's been a systematic move away from sort of traditional Freudian approaches. In the 1970s and 80s, psychotherapists came out saying they noticed also his early writings, he talked about all this abuse in families, and the queries, the powerful benefactors have funded his research and enabled him to write all those books instead of work a job, whether this was a way he suppressed it to keep the social order. So if we think, even homosexuality was in the DSM till 1980. So you go back 100 years plus, there was probably a lot of hush-hush, and he contorted his whole theory to, wave away the child. It's terrible. I'm not a fan of him anymore, although I respect what he did. But I got mixed feelings there. So there's a big shift away from that Freudian thinking. Things went very CBT, so challenging negative thinking and avoidant behaviours. And Beck really moved away from that. Manualised based CBT was done really to compare to early antidepressants, which seem to have, antidepressants have their role, and they were trying to study what's better, counselling or medications. And so that's the history of CBT initially. It was a manualised way of studying it and doing it in randomised controlled trials. Now, what happened in the late 20th century, 1900s, is there was a big drop away from psychotherapy. So it was all Freud and therapy to then just pills and think positive. And if pills and think positive work, I'm all for it. Quick, friendly, less costly things. So I tell all my patients, if I'm a taxi driver, I'm going to take the fast way to the long way. So there's a lot of people where antidepressants or CBT can help, but there's been a real overcorrection away from individual therapy to really in the evidence-based medicine, what I call RCT, randomised controlled trials. So unless there's a randomised controlled trial, it's the devil. So, and broadly, randomised controlled trials cover some things that are testable, tablet A versus tablet B. There's about 40,000 US per recruit to do a randomised controlled trial now, the regulatory standards. And then in psychotherapy, the double blinding, the patient knows if they're waitlist controlled or just told what did they do on the weekend, as opposed to telling me about your childhood. So there's a limitation to doing these double blind randomised controlled trials. So there's been a shift, again, away from therapy towards meds, manualised CBT, and a shift away from respecting individual narratives and psychotherapy approaches to, if there's not RCTs, it's snake oil. So William Osler is one of those sort of old-fashioned physicians who's quoted by medical practitioners. He was a Canadian physician, and he often the old wisdom cuts through the generations. So a good physician treats the disease, a great physician treats the patient who has the disease. He was talking about individual human experience, not the percentage tennis of the disease pattern. So epistemology is just a fancy word for saying how we come to know truth. So I always like to say, like to other professors, what are the epistemological limits of what we're discussing? So what is truth? There's no perfect answer. There's a whole bunch of philosophies. But it can be broken into empiricism, randomised controlled trials, measuring things, experiments, and ontological, your story, your lived experience, your narrative, your experience of falling in love or picking a career. That doesn't fit into an RCT. So there's this tension in understanding the truth between those two domains of thinking. What has been will be again, what has been done will be done again. There is nothing new under the sun. So one of the greats of modern psychotherapy in the post-Freudian era and moving beyond pills and more pills and RCTs only was Carl Rogers. And he said it beautifully, he said, when the other person is hurting, confused, troubled, anxious, alienated, terrified, or when he or she is doubtful of self-worth, uncertain as to identity, then understanding is called for. The gentle and sensitive companionship of an empathic stance provides illumination and healing. In such situations, deep understanding is, I believe, the most precious gift one can give to another. So Carl Rogers talked about the Rogerian principles of therapy, just being a good empath, tuning into somebody, empathic congruence, unconditional positive regard. So it's almost like being that positive parenting or coaching figure over time is intrinsically healing. And this is actually cut across most therapies. So when they examine quite rigorously, so this is work by Norcross and others, very prolific academic psychologists in the US, they look at the factors that affect success of psychotherapy. And there's a lot of other factors, like are you drinking, what's the home environment like, how much is this costing me, financial stress, a lot of other, look at that. The type of therapy is only 15%. So don't feel like, oh, I'm not a Freudian or a Jungian or a whatever in. It's and then the relationship is twice the type of the therapy. So if you've kind of got high emotional acuity, empathic stamina and stuff, and if you're like a mega empath, I think that's where that all comes in. And some of it's, placebo expectancy. So this is really encouraging. If you're an empath with stamina, you are needed. And more data, they crunch into the data, large meta-analysis, many thousands of people. They look at, demonstrated factors to good outcomes in therapy, and it's stuff like alliance and empathy, the basics, those Rogerian basics. There's a hard science around it as well. So sort of functional MRI studies, modest sort of sample sizes, sort of 300 odd, really looking at brain activation pre and post therapy, and correlates therapy changes the brain, just like somebody gets better with an antidepressant. And the depressive symptoms change, and it's the same circuits in the brain that are involved. So there's kind of like, that's nice, that correlates as well. There's also looking at empathy and mentalizing networks. So mentalization is really an ability to feel what somebody's feeling. It's almost a concept of mind and empathy, overlapping constructs. And there does appear to be a powerful empathy network. Again, involving all of these mood circuits as well. So again, like there is sort of like brain science mapping as well to confirm what we already kind of knew. And so it used to be the thinking was counselling or pills, but of course it's and or giving people agency. So also look at what do you want to do? Shared decision making. And so I think the trap is when we take a position, we actually take away their agency. We should try and be more neutral. We might have our own lived experience of what we prefer. We can put that on the table. But then I say, but I prefer your agency above mine. And that always looks well. We'll do that. So again, it's not either or, it's finding out what suits them. This is kind of, I'm trying to change how people think in the establishment of psychiatry. So that's the tall order. So there's lots of long words here, but whether we're in this enlightenment, we're going from this hyper-empiricism, RCTs only, but we're not going to hyper-ontology or listen to the new Freud. Somewhere in between, we want to do percentage tennis, healthcare, meds, CBT, EMDR, but also that individual experience. We don't want to throw away individual psychotherapy, it's worthless. So I'm wondering whether we're actually going from just listen to Freud to RCTs only to somewhere in between, and whether this is a new enlightenment. So I'm going to just whiz through what I've put as my approach to therapy, and it's really built on evolutionary design and the empathic spectrum. So Bowlby was one of the early writers in this field. He looked at kids in hospitals or in orphanage settings and would see they developed really insecure attachments. They couldn't bond to parent figures, and he's got these different patterns of that. Many of you will be familiar with that work. It was the first major body of work that really focused on looking at evolutionary design as being a key factor. And the neurobiology of that appears to be the oxytocinergic system. So we know from like these devices are all designed to get us addicted to our dopamine system. So we keep clicking and somebody makes money. It doesn't do anything to our oxytocinergic system. And that's why having a coffee with somebody face to face makes it feel better. More than just doing it over a Zoom or a FaceTime. So there's this whole oxytocinergic system, which is profoundly impacted by early nurturing experiences and has genetic influences as well. So some people might have more brittle oxytocinergic systems as well, a greater propensity to dysregulation later in life if they have suboptimal attachments. Now, the way I look at it, when I was trying to understand what therapy was as kind of a 20-year ago Geelong psychiatrist, I said, well, maybe it's got to do with working in groups. So the caged person alone got killed. In groups, you ate mammoth. And so group activity means all for one, one for all. So there has to be a bond. When you suffer, I suffer. When you die, I die. When your joy is mine. And so I think that's what the oxytocin system is. It bonds us in groups. This is a busy slide you don't have to go into, but there's a lot of genetic studies now and imaging studies to suggest that empathy and attachment in part is probably genetic. So some people are born with a greater capacity to empathise and have remorse, and others less. So if we think of a tribe, the super empaths with a big remorse are great in the creche. They're terrible at killing the next tribe in a family. The psychopathic narcissist has got a superpower. Ooh, all the babies of the tribe are starving. I'll kill the next tribe and bring the food over and sleep on it. Empaths can't do that. But then you leave those sorts in charge of the creche. I'll use the creche just to get my needs filled, and then I'll sleep on it. Well, there you've got that 28.5% abuse statistic. And it's not out there, it's everywhere. If it's 28.5%, there are households where you get that. And so I think this has helped a lot of patients go, oh, that makes sense. Dad was always remorseless and unempathic, you know, and I tried to blame myself. So instead of it being a way of saying it's not their fault and not holding them to account, which would be the dark side of such a thing, it's a way of making sense of that. They go, oh, that makes sense. We needed the nasty cave person too. Mother Nature just cares about survival or reproduction. The brain is a survival machine. It's not a truth or justice machine. You look at real wildlife documentaries, it's not pretty. The lion's eating the zebra that's still alive. Mother Nature is tough. So again, thinking about empathy in families might be in a spectrum. And so you might have a child who into a family, and both the child's are very empathic, altruistic, and just by random chance, the parents, the genetic lottery, they've got different blood types, different immune types, different empathic types. So if you've got an empathic child to low empathy parents, higher odds of that lack of empathic attunement, an alienated child, an emotionally vulnerable child, the child who actually maybe preyed on self-gratification, glorification. So this is the concept, and I wasn't sure if this was new or just reinventing the wheel. So it's looking like it's new. The other idea is empathic acuity. So they'll say, mum and dad were empathic and nice, but I could conceal everything. Like I was being molested by the uncle or whatever it was, and I could just hide it because I didn't want to burden them. And I said, wow, they couldn't see you. And so I think there are empaths who are like a 1 megapixel camera and ones who are like a 20 megapixel camera, where it's almost like you can just sense something's wrong. And, you know, it's like, you're telling me you're good this week, but I don't feel what's happening. Some people don't have that. And I think it's like almost colour blindness. So in the extreme example, some people just have empathy for self. They can't see it in anybody else. Garden variety might be you pick up somebody's really bad day. High level acuity is you just read people like, oh, you said you were happy, but I don't believe it. What's going on? And they melt. And I think that's just a trait as well. Again, I can't prove these, but I think that empathy spectrum and acuity are traits. We're meant to be in Fiji. No, we're meant to be in villages. And because of progress, we're here. So this curious finding that as countries industrialise, they become more prosperous but more miserable. Maybe this is an explanation. When we're in a village, there was a multiplicity of parenting figures, better odds of a match, a lot of eyes and ears. Terrible on your wedding night, great for child protection. So again, the approach is help, instead of blaming self or parents, trying to understand where was my family on the empathic spectrum. And if there's an empathic attunement, the child feels understood, not like an alien, not weak, They've learned to self-validate, self-empathize. So they're rescued and nurtured to like self-nurture and self-rescue. So, and now in these nuclear families, this is one or two parents, but now both parents are working to own a home. So they're either not there or burnt out. It's like big business did all the social engineering. You know, the bankers, you know, but so it's kind of like, and when we're in the village, there was a multiplicity, with multiple parenting figures, uncles, aunts, aunts, siblings, cousins. So the odds you'd find someone in your wavelength were much higher. That's decreased. So I think the Industrial Revolution, nuclearisation of families is also part of, you know, what's led to these patterns. Now, the good news is with evolutionary design, I believe that we can also explain a powerful system called grief healing. So I remember in my Googling infant mortality, Great Britain, 1900, pre-antibiotic era, at the peak of the biggest empire in history, 15%. So it was commonplace that a mother would be holding a dead baby. That's a level 1 trauma. It is. Being mistreated as a child is level 1 trauma. And then if you had 10 kids, you'll have multiple dead babies. So this is, and it's only relatively recently that's become rare. So this trauma of death in child, you know, young children is high. And even in the animal kingdom, we see sophisticated group mammals, they grieve, you know, the loss of a calf or a relative. But then they need a mechanism to get hungry again, eat, drink, get frisky again. Mother Nature's the boss, right? Survive, reproduce. Eat, damn, drink, reproduce. So there must be a mechanism by which we can get over the hurt, even of a lost child or a terrible child. And I think that critical loss stages are actually wired in, just like stages of inflammation are physiologic. I believe that there is a system where we go through these stages as part of adjusting. And a lot of people get arrested and never get beyond the denial or self-blame stage, and then can't access their grief healing system. They may stay dissociated from it, or they may stay self-blaming from it, rather than digesting it, because going there would be overwhelming. We're designed not to fight our tribe. The best way a child survives is fight yourself, not your tribe. That's why separation anxiety is such an anxiety. Little kid will still run to the toxic tribe. This is why your best odds of survival, don't run to the jungle, don't run to the other tribe, run to the tribe you know, better than the devil you know. Even that makes evolutionary design sense. Grief system innovate, so there's no real hard data yet, but I believe there is a grief system, just like the brainstem has a you would breathe, you can't hold your breath in suicide reflex. I think there is a grief healing system. If we can access it, you can digest hellish trauma. I first-hand guy that does it with people, hundreds. The worst trauma you could hear of, the stuff you don't want to think about, goes away. There's an incredibly powerful healing system, and that's the exciting news. And so, you know, there's another fancy word, teleology, is understanding something through its function. So understanding a knife through its sharpness, not how many milligrams of metal it's got in it. So understanding a grief healing system so we can grieve the loss, show our unity, but then move on, get frisky again, survival, reproduction. So I think evolutionary design makes a lot of sense. And so, and for the sake of time, I'll skip through some of these things, but I've touched already on the villages, touched on a lot of that, empathic spectrum, mismatch hope, direct abilities, touched on that already. So is this my hope is this is a new way of unifying everything into a simple way. And my crazy hope is, just from 20 years of explaining this to patients, it makes them feel less like a victim and less unfixable. They feel like an unfixable victim. It doesn't really help if they go, oh, Mother Nature, damn it. I thought my mum was tough. Mother Nature's tough, but she's our mother. Right? What are we going to do? And they start to understand all these factors. It changes their frame from unfixable, hopeless to, I get it, I'm part of Mother Nature. Ooh, there's a healing pathway. So as a psychoeducation tool, I found it very useful. And those kind of, that key, the trinity of process, self-validate, self-empathise and grief heal. So if you invalidate your hurts, I'm just a weak idiot. I don't have the right to have hurts. You're never going to digest them. If you dissociate from them because they're overwhelming, you're never going to digest them. So ability to self-validate, self-empathise, Often you need that co-pilot person to help them weather the emotional storm of connecting and to contain it. And then they sit with the hurt plus time. It's usually a handful of weeks. So often say, they've got a broken leg, 6 weeks for it to sit with the hurt for a handful of weeks. And magically it starts to feel like old news, like clockwork. So several hundred cases over 20 years of intensive individual therapy. The problem is scaling it. And it's almost like people go from empathy only to others and none to self, to a balance of empathy to others and self. They go from a vicious self-coach to a kind self-coach. They get their cholesterol and hemoglobin A1C checked. They try and stop smoking. And suddenly, instead of us having to administer care, it starts to manifest autonomously. It does take time, and so it's approximately weekly. So it's a brief psychodynamic therapy, 9 to 18 months minimum. And I've tried to outline it in a simple way. And I also have an agenda, which is where I'm going to end the talk, is I don't think this has to be the enemy. It can be. And so what I'm hoping to do around the book, which continues to do well, is actually to build an app. And then it might actually help somebody who's a care worker on the ground, if they're trying to work through the issues, maybe use the book as bibliotherapy. But if they're wanting to figure out something, whether it can even offer suggestions. I mean, it might be able to say, well, you know, look, this might not help, but maybe focus on these areas. I've got no idea, but I do want to put a dent in the damn burden of illness. And just as one psychiatrist got no chance. So if there was a way where we could have an army of empaths at the front line, doing what they can, but then some karate moves, that would make me very happy. And with that, I'll end the formal part of the presentation. Oh, actually, I've got the paper. This is my last slide. Was a chief sitting bull who was part of Colonel Sanders' last stand. For us, warriors are not what you think of as warriors. The warrior is not someone who fights, because no one has the right to take another's life. The warrior for us is one who sacrifices himself for the good of others. His task is to take care of the elderly, the defenceless, those who cannot provide for themselves, and above all, the children, the future of humanity. How can you not love that? And my last sort of thing is a call to action. I guess now I think about it, it's fairly ambitious, but what the heck? I believe if we heal bruised empaths, we can take over the halls of power. So the boards of companies and the cabinets of governments tend to be full of the unempathic, remorseless ones. And I reckon the empaths get burnt out mid-career. So one of the things I like doing greatly, I call it derivative benefits, is you might have that school principal who's burning out. You help them stay in the game, they can change a whole culture. And I think what's happening globally, it's not nice, is can we explain psychodynamically? The people in charge of cabinets and boards are disproportionately the remorseless, unempathic types. And with that, I'll end. Yes, that is it.
Quite ended yet. So what we're going to ask you to do now, it's a little bit space, not deprived, it's just an interesting space here. I'm going to get you all stand up, go out. Gina's out there. Gina's going to whip it out. Help yourself a drink, because we're all capable adults. I don't need to serve yourself a drink. So there's mineral waters, there's some wine, there's non-alcoholic beer, there's soft drinks, there's lots of things out there to choose. There's champagne, whatever. Please don't feel that you don't have to drink alcohol, or you want to drink out with whatever you want. There's dinner out there, and by the time you grab that, this is going to be set up for tables and dinner. And the idea is you get to come back here, pick AJ's mind, and keep going for a bit longer, okay? This isn't the finish. So we want that discussion to keep going. AJ might have some more stuff he might like to tell you. Mainly we consolidated, or he did anyway, thanks, the information into this, and for the people that are online now, so they'll probably disappear and eat their own dinners and whatnot. But please stay, because we have got plenty of food, and thank you very much. It's not only help himself out there, and give me 5 or so seconds or something to transform this room into tables and chairs.
Second was ambition.
We're not about.
Definitely way to go.
I could hear Tummy's rumbling. Started the job through.
Thank you. No. It's better doing shit like this. Tell you that, bro. 5 minutes to make this. And 5 minutes to open this up, put cards in, where that back now. Strategically.
John, what's another? Tables in.
So full tables in. It's now we get 2 tables with 6 on each side.
Which on each side?
It'd be 5 on each side. It'd be 24. 3 tables. Yeah. There, I think there. Sorry, after the bomb. Oh, it's just, I can't all those things now.
It's just one toilet in it. So oh, thank you for it.
It's just like that, we have a dining table. That's how it goes. What is it? Wow, that was quick.